Hi and welcome back to this final episode in this beginner series. What we're going to look at today is setting up the lights to get some nice shadowing effect in our scene, and then we're going to get into the render settings and finally render out our animation and get it posted up on YouTube or wherever you feel like posting it. Okay, so let's get started. Let's load up our scene. Here we are, and if we take a look at it, we'll see, if I just zoom out a little bit and I hide my toolbars. As you can see in our scene, we have this little object which is our lamp, and that's the thing that causes all the shadows and allows you to see everything. And if we go over to our settings in our properties panel and click on the little light icon, you can see we have lots of different settings. The preview shows you how the light looks in the scene, what kind of coverage it's got. If we just go to a point lamp, you can see that changes to a really small diffused area of light. The sun lamp fills the area. Spot lamp gives you a circle, and as you can see from the lamp shape, you've got this big cone that defines the area, and you can change the shape of that with the tools here. A hemi lamp is just like a big floodlight that covers the whole area. An area lamp is also like a floodlight, but more like you would have at a football stadium perhaps. And you can adjust the size and shape of the lamp down here in where it says area shape. And you can feel free to play around with those settings if you go into the render viewports shading settings. You'll be able to see the effect that those lamps have on your scene. As you can see, the area lamp just gives you a big bright floodlit area. But we're going to change back to a sun lamp, and that's how our scene looks by default. I'm going to change it from rendered view into textured view. There we go. Okay, so our light's pointing in this direction. If I scroll into the actual view, we can see the shadows on the floor from our mesh lamp. Okay, you can change the colour of the lamp, have it make it nice bright red if you want, and that totally changes the lighting in the scene. Gives you this quite interesting early morning sunset kind of look, but it's not great, so that's just to give you an idea. Put it back to white. Calculating the lamps does take a little bit of time sometimes. There we go, that's good enough. Negative just turns the light so it's projecting darkness everywhere. And you can have additional lights in this scene to just highlight the objects in the scene. Turn that off. Specular makes sure all these show up. These little highlights that you get everywhere. Diffuse makes sure that the actual colour of the scene is shown up, so you can turn the diffuse off and you would just see the specular highlights in the render. That can be quite fun sometimes if you want a spooky scene. Sky and atmosphere, you want to get these on the sun lamp. Basically they create the background, whereas at the moment we've got a default world setting with this transition. By applying the sky settings, it creates an overlay for that, which makes it darker basically. It can be useful for changing the lights in some cases, but mainly it's the atmosphere which adds a kind of fog over the scene, and then you can change the intensity and things. I'm not going to turn it on right now because it takes ages to render and show through. The main thing we want to look at is the shadows. At the moment it's set to ray shadow, and a ray shadow is essentially what it says it is. It's a ray from the light that when it hits an object it creates a shadow pixel on the object it falls on. Basically, you have no shadow. It just turns off all the shadows from that light and makes things look horrible, so we'll turn that on. You can choose which layer the light affects, and you can have it to show only shadows. So you could have additional lamps in the scene, turn only shadow on, and then you would get these shadows, whereas you could have light coming in from a different direction, which would be quite funky. But what we want really is the colour, because as you can see in our scene, the shadow itself is quite black and it blocks out everything that it hits. So if we turn it to a grey colour, it'll start to become more and more transparent. So if I aim for about a mid-grey, now you can see our shadows are see-through. You can see behind the car, it's not occluding everything, and it's not looking too sharp. Well, the edges are looking sharp, and we're going to fix that now, but the actual shadow itself is looking a little bit more natural. The next thing we want to look at is the sampling, and this gives us our soft edges to our shadows. And if we turn the sampling up to, let's say, 20, no, let's not have 20, let's just have 2, press enter, there we go. And if we turn the sampling up to 5, that'll ease out any noise that we get on the edges and make that blend a little bit smoother, nicer to look at. Adaptive QMC versus constant QMC. Adaptive is a fast way of sampling. Constant is a slower, but it gets really a lot better results in the end, which would do for major production scenes, I guess. In this little one we don't need to worry too much. Threshold, not quite sure what that does. I generally leave it at default. But now we've got our shadows in place, soft size of 2, samples of 5. Let's switch over to our rendered view and see how they look. And as you can see, the shadows have diffused a little bit. Our shadows on the ground are actually leaf shadows, which is good. Yeah, but you'll see we're getting a little bit of red in the edges of the shadows because it's sampling from the object to the edge of the shadow, so we pick up a little bit of colour from that. Could ease that out by putting a bit of colour into the shadows, but then you'd have red shadows, and why would you want that, especially on the trees? Because if you look at the tree shadow, we've got a little bit of the green showing through from the green of the trees. I don't know how realistic that is. Do you get coloured shadows from things? I think not, but never mind. That's the way Blender Internal deals with shadows. Okay, so we've done everything in our scene now. We've built our objects, set up our materials here, there, and everywhere. Set up our particle systems. We have our reflections and our shadows and our highlights, and we have our lamps. And everything is looking beautiful. So now finally we get to the point where we get to turn it into a movie, and we do that by coming to this little camera icon at the start of our our properties bar. Tap that tab and we see the render options. The first render option is a single screen from our camera view. If I just press number pad 0, if I hit this render button, we'll get a render of this single image as it is now, and I'll do that. It should be quite quick. There we go, this is what a render looks like. You've got these little boxes floating around, and that's building up the picture and placing it into the screen. Now if that's all you want, I bet I've got specular on there. I'll fix those in a minute. If that's all you want, you just want a single image that you can post on Facebook to your friends and say, look what I've done, aren't I fantastic? And have everyone say, yeah, wow. You just click on the image at the bottom on this bottom taskbar, header bar, I think it's called. Click on image, and you want save as image, or you can simply press F3 and it brings you into your file menu. Choose a file to save it in, give it a name, click save as image, job done, upload it to Facebook. But I want to go a little bit further, and like I said, we've got some square showing up on these planes, and I think that's because we have specular highlights still selected. So I'm going to go back to my 3D view, go back to my materials. I want to go to my particles layer, pick my leaf and turn the specular off for that completely. We go back to our layer. Now when we're rendering, with our layers panel down here, we want to select everything that we want to render. So we've got the car and the trees and the road on layer 1. On layer 2 we have our particle system, so we need to press shift and click the particle system so that they show up on our scene and in our final render. Now I've had a little fix of those leaves, so I'm going to press F12 again, which if I go back to my render settings, F12 is the same as pressing the render button. So if I do that, you'll see now we've fixed that squareness issue that was showing up the actual plane, and there's no specular highlights on the leaves. If we wanted highlights on the leaves, we could put in a specular map, which is just a black and white image of the leaf, where the white would be the specular highlights. But these leaves are so tiny, we don't need to fuss with that today. We'll get more into specular and bump maps and image maps in a separate tutorial when we get on to dealing with textures. Anyway, we've fixed that, so now we'll go back to our 3D view. Animation, we'll get to that in a minute because we're about to do that. Display just gives you options on how it displays, whether it renders on a full screen image or if it opens a new window for Blender that you can put to one side while you carry on with doing things in your scene, or it just opens up the UV window like it has been doing. Now dimensions, this is the size of your camera and how big the image is going to be. And in the presets you have your standard 1080p DVDs, HDTV 1080, HDV 1080, and then you got your TV sizes 16:9, NTSC settings, which is the American standard, and PAL, which is the European standard, and I think Japanese standard as well. I'm not sure what countries have which, to be honest. I'm sure you know what system you are using where you live. Default resolution is 1920 by 1080. It's set at 50%, so it actually renders half of that, which is 540 by 710. What's half of 19? I don't know. It's half of that size. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, frame range. You can adjust this to tell Blender to start recording from a certain frame. So I'm on frame 70 right now. I could type 70 in there and my animation would record from that point. Start frame 1, it starts from frame 1. End frame 250. That's how long our film will last. And I'm going to change that by clicking that and typing 240, enter, and that's because we have this frame rate of 24 frames per second, so 240 frames will give us a 10-second animation. You can change the frame rate in there to one more suitable for your system, 60 frames a second. So yeah, so you could choose 30 frames per second or 25 frames. It's entirely your choice for your project and your output device. I'm going to leave it at 24 frames. Aspect ratio 1:1, yeah, means nothing to me. Border select, if I click that, you get this red border around the camera, and that simply means that it will only calculate what it sees in the border. All this guff outside, it doesn't need to calculate that stuff, so it won't. Frame step, that tells it how many frames to calculate. So as it's set to 1, it will calculate every 1 frame. If I set it to 2, it will calculate every 2 frames, so it will calculate frame 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. Anti-aliasing, what that does is smooths out these heavy edges where it's jagged in the viewport. The anti-aliasing will smooth that out and make it look nice. And you can change the sampling amount right up to 16 just to get the smoothest edges, but that obviously will take longer to calculate. Sampled motion blur for moving objects, because the car itself isn't moving and the road is, it will look weird if we sample the motion blur. These will blur, the road will blur, the car will stay still, so it'll look like it's a stationary thing and the road's moving underneath it, and that's not the illusion we want. Shading gives us options for what to render, so you could turn off the shadows, turn off ray tracing, turn off subsurface scattering. Turn that off because we're not using it. Alpha, you can choose a transparent alpha or a sky alpha. We're going to use the sky because that's what we've got set up in our world. If we choose transparent, this background will render as invisible, and you'll be able to composite your own sky textures in the back there in the compositor. Post-processing, you can choose to have it render from the compositor or the sequencer. We're going to use the sequencer later, and we'll leave those checked because it's not going to do anything, because there's nothing in them at the moment. Stamp puts a timestamp in your frame, and the other important one for us to realise is the output, and currently the output is set by default to your TMP file, which is a temporary file in your hard drive. So if I just click on the files there, go to computer, open up the local disk, you'll see just on your local disk down here there's a temp file which is probably full of guff and viruses and spam, and a TMP file which is where temporary files are stored. See, crash report and various autosaves for Blender. That's all these are. These are just regular files that it autosaves over every now and again. If you've got that checkbox ticked in the user preferences, which you should have because I told you to in the very first lesson. So we'll hide that now. We're going to output to our TMP file. We're going to choose PNG files. And if we look at the file format, we've got a choice of image files and a choice of movie files. Now you could just click on H.264 if you want, or whatever movie file you want to output to, but we don't do that. We choose an image file to start with, and the reason for that is because if anything happens and it crashes halfway through rendering the whole animation, or if the electric goes off, or if thieves come around and steal your piece, oh, that wouldn't help you really, would it? Regardless, if something goes wrong and it's being downloaded to a film, you'll lose all the render time. And if you've got heavy scenes that are taking 10 minutes to render and you've been sat waiting for 3 weeks to get your computer back, that's the very last thing you want to happen. But if it's rendering frames to PNGs and it crashes, then you can always restart the rendering from the last frame that it crashed and you won't lose anything. So saying that, we'll get on with it. We'll start with the PNG. We'll leave the 8-bit color depth. We could put it up to 16 and be awesome, but what's the point? Bake options are for taking textures, whether it's a light texture, a color texture, a bump texture, and painting them to a UV object. So we would unwrap the object, create an image, and then we could bake down different settings. So you can choose the specular colours, specular intensity, displacement textures, the actual textures, shadows, normals, ambient, all sorts of things, and that just gives you an image based on the scene that you can then apply as a texture to your materials, and that just saves calculating time later on. This freestyle thing, this allows you to put line edges on your model, and you can basically turn this into something that looks more like a drawing. I'm not going to use freestyle because I haven't used it yet. I should have done really, because it's pretty cool, but I've been doing other things and I'm not quite sure what all the settings are about yet. But nonetheless, let's carry on with our thing. We'll close those windows down. So we've got our output set up to our TMP file. We've chosen a PNG as our output source. We've got our post-processing set up. Our shading is set up. I will turn that on. It doesn't matter if it's on or off by default. Anti-aliasing is set up at 8. That's fine for this scene. If your scene was more Hollywood, you might turn it up to 16 and get a better result. Under dimensions, this 50%, we are now going to turn it up to 100%. That will make those little squares we saw smaller, and it will take longer to render the scene, but you'll get a full size 1920 by 1080 HD film at the end of it. So without further ado, I'm going to hit animation. This will take about, depending on your system, between 5 minutes and maybe half an hour. I'm going to pause the recording and come back to you when it's done. Set it going first. You'll see it's taking a little bit of time to start up. We'll get through our first one. We're on frame 1. It's going to tell us exactly how long each frame is going to take. Well, how long the last frame took, how long this frame's taking. And you can see immediately the difference. The last frame was at 50%. It took 14 seconds. We're already coming up to twice that, at twice the size, and we're still only halfway through the render. So it's going to take about 45 seconds to a minute to render each scene. So as soon as this one's done, I'll pause it and come back once we have everything set up. There we go. Last square's done, so I'll see you in a minute.